So how is the global north responding to this then? How is the U.S. responding? By and large, total deafening silence, right? We don't, the mainstream discourse doesn't even acknowledge that climate change is a problem, that it's already a problem, let alone could be a problem. The science is rejected, and I'm sure you all know that a lot of this has to do with the direct intervention of the Koch brothers and ExxonMobil, who have invested millions of dollars in messaging to try and sow doubt and cast aspersions on the science. It wasn't helped by the fact that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's main clearinghouse for science, which is actually a very conservative organization because industry and government, as well as science, gets to decide what is considered the consensus. So it's hardly radical. But they had a couple of stupid mistakes. One in particular that was just an unchecked footnote about the rate of glacial melt in the Himalayas that was based on a newspaper article. It was like, it was pretty bad that had slipped through. But once they corrected that, the findings of the fourth assessment report didn't change at all. But the climate denialists, what my colleague Mark Hertzgaard likes to call, and I agree with him, the climate cranks, latched onto that, and it had an element of truth to it. So that really kind of pushed climate change off the agenda. Then it's unfortunate that Van Jones was then outed as a former Maoist and pilloried by Glenn Beck, because then that pushed the green jobs discussion and agenda completely, sidelined it. And I think that discourse, those policies make a lot of sense. And I hope that we can return to that conversation and pursue those policies. So we don't really have a formal response to climate change, but what is developing is a sort of informal response, I think, on the border and in the Pentagon. And the Pentagon, to its credit, and the armed services in general, take climate change seriously. At least their planning components do. And they don't question the scientific consensus, and they have done numerous studies, some of them secret, some of them public, that you can download on the internet. Climate change as a security concern has been worked into the Quadrennial Defense Review, the sort of broad strategy document that the armed services have to come up with every 4 years. And what they see is a future in which there isn't so much an increase in conventional wars between states, but there's an increase in state collapse, insurgency, religious warfare, intercommunal violence, mass migration, banditry, internal civil strife, humanitarian crisis, and the armed services realize they are going to be called upon to respond to that. And so their main method of response they're developing is counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. And as I mentioned to you before, I think that counterinsurgency is highly problematic because it attacks civilian society and weakens it ultimately. Because it's about winning hearts and minds, it's not about controlling territory. It necessarily penetrates into the social fabric and corrupts it and destroys it. An interesting fact, the Allies' strategic bombing campaign in Europe during World War II was found to not break the will of Germans at all. It made people more united. Likewise, the German bombing of London, people banded together. I mean, out of that experience of the Blitz, where 20,000 people died, came essentially a massive legitimizing boost, political boost for what becomes British social democracy, British post-war social democracy. They began by rationing, milk to people. And once they started rationing milk, they realized, before there was a ration, this ceiling on how much everybody could have, some people didn't even have a floor. Some kids didn't even get any milk. And so they came out of the war with this, intensified social solidarity. And during the war, there were lots of studies of that. The Beveridge Report is the famous report that kind of makes the bridge from the Blitz to social democracy in England. Civilian casualties in wars in the West have gone, from about 5% during World War I to more like 40% during World War II, up to like 90%. In most conflicts now, 90% of casualties are civilians, and that too is a measure of this counterinsurgency methodology. So counterinsurgency has the exact opposite. I'm not advocating conventional warfare. I'm not advocating strategic bombing campaigns or anything like that. But just to illustrate how it's not as simple, the damage that war does is not as simple as how many buildings were destroyed, how many people were killed. That's all important. But then there's these sociological questions of the kind of social damage that long-term, low-intensity conflict does to a society. And what it does is it makes societies that are not resilient and not capable, riven with corruption, incapable of planning, and not prepared to adapt to climate change, the climate change we're locked in for, or to mitigate and transform their economies. So counterinsurgency, I think, is highly problematic. I wouldn't expect anything different, really, from the Pentagon. They don't make policy. They just, their job is to fight wars. And to their credit, in all these reports, they generally say, this is what we're going to do, but it'll only work for so long unless there's mitigation, unless there is a decarbonization of our economy. We can't keep a lid on things by force of arms forever, which is a lot more than you can say in terms of the realism than for the House leadership, the GOP House leadership, or even many in the Obama administration. The other unplanned kind of de facto response to climate change is border militarization. It wasn't caused by climate change, but increasingly I think it is a response to the crisis that is produced in part by climate change. And there are some people on the right who understand it as such and see it as such. Brenda Walker, for example, is a virulently anti-immigrant environmentalist in California. And she wants to militarize the border and strip immigrants of their rights and get rid of them. And you can imagine how, as the environmental crisis becomes undeniable, how that could become a sort of mainstream discourse. There was something else about border militarization. Anyway, so I mean, and in case you aren't aware of, what this phenomena is, I mean, it begins in the 1990s. There's a real ramping up of a crackdown on the border. We now have about 700 miles of the 2,000-mile border that is fenced off with metal fencing. There's hand-me-down military motion sensors, surveillance cameras, routine helicopter patrols, routine joint operations between Border Patrol and the National Guard and the military, and a largely private detention network in which there are about 30,000 undocumented immigrants on any given night who do not have standard civil rights because frequently they're just going to be summarily deported. They haven't been charged with serious crimes. They're not going into criminal court. They're just being held and warehoused and processed in really miserable conditions. This is not caused by climate change, but increasingly that infrastructure of surveillance and repression, I think, is going to get an invigorating jolt from this crisis if we don't pursue other policies. And that is the form of violence that I see in developed economies. Later down the line, if you read the Pentagon reports, we take what they're saying, we could imagine state collapse and, really nightmarish situations. But I think what happens in this current moment is climate change, the catastrophic convergence of cheap guns and poverty and inequality with extreme weather creates state failure, state fragility in the global south, and a kind of instinctive state hardening in the OECD countries, the militarization of borders. And you see it throughout Europe, same thing. It's not always articulated as being about climate change, but increasingly it will be. And it's this anti-immigrant, we've got ours, this is an armed lifeboat, keep them out. So that's how I see the violence of climate change expressed in developed economies. So what should we be doing? We should be, obviously, learning to adapt to climate change because we're locked in for more disruptive climate change, even if the world economy collapsed tonight and not another electric light bulb was ever turned on. There's enough CO2 in the atmosphere for the effects to keep kicking in for decades into the future. So we need to learn to adapt to that, and that's why an international agreement is important, and the Obama administration has not taken the international negotiations around a successor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol seriously. Those are dragging on, but a key part of that would be a fund to transfer capital and technology from the wealthy economies, G20 economies, to the global south so that they can adapt and also mitigate the problem. And very fundamentally, we must cut our emissions. There are some progressives environmentalists, who I see around the issue of climate change and also oil, embrace catastrophe. There's a type of catastrophism, which I think is a wish expressed as a fear. You say, oh, society's going to collapse because of peak oil. And it's like, well, you would sort of like to overthrow capitalism, but you can't, so you hope that it will collapse when the oil runs out. But of course, the more expensive oil gets, the more feasible it is to get distant oil. And the same, to some extent, I've heard in conversations with people about climate change. Really what they want to do is they want to overthrow this society and transform it into some sort of utopian, localistic, eco-friendly, regionally based, self-governed, autonomous world. But they don't have anywhere near the political capacity to do that. So the hope is that climate change will wipe out capitalism and then communities will come in and organize themselves. And I don't actually buy that. I think that more likely there would be warlordism rather than collective autonomous communities. So mitigation is extremely important, and there's a lot that can be done. Even with the sclerotic Congress incapable of taking the science seriously, the EPA has been empowered to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We are waiting for those rules to come down from the EPA, and there's been a delay. This was litigated from the late 90s to 2007, and then the Supreme Court said, yep, the Clean Air Act applies to greenhouse gas emissions. The EPA has the obligation to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And the Bush administration was just like, oh, that's interesting, and ignored it. Obama came in, appointed a decent head of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, but they have not moved forward aggressively with these tailoring rules to essentially impose a de facto carbon tax, which is what these regulations could do. And progressives don't want to say that because that's such a right-wing talking point. No new taxes, but yeah, no, that's what we want. We want a carbon tax on coal and oil so that the energy from those sources will be expensive and energy from clean sources will be in greater demand because it's cheaper, and thus investment in those clean sources will be more profitable, and thus capital will move in those directions. What we want is to annihilate and retire and write off the fossil fuel infrastructure and move to another one. So the EPA could play a very important role in that. The other thing, and it doesn't require getting approval from anyone. This is the law. The other thing the government could do without getting more money from Congress or anything is use its purchasing power to jumpstart clean technology. The federal government and state governments together constitute about a third of the U.S. GDP. The federal government has the largest single fleet of vehicles in the country, largest fleet of buildings, and is the largest single energy consumer. And admittedly, a lot of that energy is Defense Department, but still, even for the 450,000 generally large office buildings that the federal government owns, they use a lot of electricity. And the federal government is going to spend, and state governments as well, lots of money on buying vehicles, 140,000 vehicles owned by the post office alone. Very few of them are electric. They could almost all be electric. Most of them drive about 18 to 20 miles a day maximum. They park in the same place every night. They're perfect for electrification. They should all be electrified. And on throughout the agencies. The government is going to buy new vehicles for the post office anyway. It happens. It's going to buy electricity for these buildings. It should be buying clean technology and retrofitting these buildings, because that would do two things. It would, one, reduce the carbon footprint of the federal government. It would reduce emissions. That would be good. And it would also create economies of scale for the burgeoning clean tech sector, which is really suffering for lack of markets and for lack of predictability. And so, when I've interviewed, I interviewed the only electric truck manufacturer in the U.S., and, they're getting little orders, dribs and drabs of orders here and there. And if they could get a schedule of orders from the government that, we want 100 trucks every year for the next 5 years, they could then buy everything they use in bulk, lower their costs, and begin to compete directly with diesel trucks. The initial cost would almost be the same as diesel, and the fuel, electricity, is so much cheaper than diesel. Then you'd get people like Frito-Lay and Budweiser, for economic reasons, being like, yeah, maybe we should have some of these local trucks be electric, because it makes economic sense. And that's what has to happen. The price gap between clean tech and dirty old technology has to close, and then the private sector will embrace these technologies, not because there's some subsidy program that if you fill out lots of paperwork, you can get 2 years of this and blah, 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 but just because it makes economic sense. So there are things that can be done right now. And Obama did issue an executive order requiring federal agencies to begin planning for basically green purchasing. But then, of course, there's been delays, and there's been this horrendous pushback from the GOP attacking the EPA. I mean, this is why they hate the EPA. The Koch brothers funded AstroTurf campaigns to go around saying that the EPA would like, you know, come ticket you for having a lawnmower. You know, there's just been a deliberate effort to attack the EPA, and it's because of the fact that the EPA is going to regulate greenhouse gas emissions.